Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gostola, and welcome to the Dissenter Weekly. It's March 17th, 2025. If you're receiving this on March 17th, thank you for being a paid subscriber of the Dissenter Weekly. This show is part of the Dissenter newsletter, which I edit and curate. And so you can go to thedissenter.org if you are not already a subscriber, and you can fund journalism on whistleblowers, secrecy, and freedom of the press. You also can get access to other exclusive content by being a paid subscriber. If you are not already following the podcast or subscribed on any of the podcasting platforms, your preferred podcasting platforms, you can now find this show on over a dozen platforms. I encourage you to go follow it there. The audio version is posted every week. And please take a moment to leave a rating. That'll help boost the amount of listeners we have for the podcast and expand the impact of the work that we do at the Dissenter. This week, we have a few headlines before we get to an interview. President Donald Trump unintelligibly and without evidence accused the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, and MSNBC of totally illegal actions when they cover him or his administration. So basically, all of the legacy media outlets that he's ever sued. And a whistleblower testified in court that the Trump administration still plans to abolish the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, despite what the Justice Department has claimed. And finally, the Florida State Senate advanced a clearly unconstitutional bill that would require media outlets to remove an online news article if a person makes any sort of a claim that the article contains false or defamatory information. But what I want to spend the most amount of time on before getting to the interview are two things that happened this past week. A threat to shut down a movie theater from Miami Beach Mayor Stephen Miner, and then the death of AT&T whistleblower Mark Klein. Miami Beach Mayor Stephen Miner threatened to shut down a movie theater for screening the Oscar-winning film No Other Land. At first, as the Miami New Times reported, the mayor wrote a letter to management urging the theater to cancel the scheduled screenings. He baselessly accused the film of promoting anti-Semitism. Since the theater is still in the old Miami Beach City Hall and that's owned by the city, Miner is pushing to end the lease for the theater, which effectively would shut down the theater. Screening movies to make sure they conform to local censors' tastes is a practice we left behind with the Red Scare. If the First Amendment doesn't mean that a movie theater can show an Oscar winning film, something is seriously wrong, declared Adam Steinbaugh of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. The ACLU of Florida weighed in. Pulling funding from an independent community based cinema under these circumstances is patently unconstitutional. And one of the film's directors, Israeli journalist Yuval Abraham, reacted when this mayor uses the word anti Semitism to silence us, Palestinians and Israelis who proudly oppose occupation and apartheid together, fighting for justice and equality for all. He is dangerously emptying it out of meaning. Banning a film only makes people more determined to see it. And this is a film that has gone through its own battle with censorship, that has received widespread attention and perhaps has actually fueled its rise in acclaim and probably helped it win the Oscar. And yet, again, we're still seeing these stories of suppression. Let's get to the death of Mark Klein, a AT&T whistleblower. If we go back to the 2000s, when the Patriot Act was adopted in October 2001 under President George W. Bush, it encouraged a public-private partnership, secret public-private partnership between telecommunications companies and the National Security Agency, or NSA. Mark Klein worked for over 20 years as a technician for the AT&T Corporation. He blew the whistle on AT&T's collaboration with the NSA, and in 2006 he went to the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and he gave documents to them on AT&T's involvement with this warrantless wiretapping program, this warrantless spying program, and his whistleblowing became the basis for that civil liberties organization and its efforts to sue the NSA for violating Americans' privacy. Now, here's a clip from the documentary that aired with Mark Klein called Spying on the Home Front. It was a PBS Frontline documentary. This shows you a little bit about Mark Klein and what he was and who he was as a truth teller. This was aired in May 2007. So here's a clip of Mark Klein.
In 2002, I was sitting at my workstation one day, and some email came in saying that somebody from the National Security Agency, NSA, was going to come visit for some business. This NSA representative showed up at the door. I happened to be the one who opened the door. I let him in.
He was doing a background check for a security clearance for one of our field engineers. He was going to be working at the Folsom Street office, and they were building a secure facility there.
And I heard from our manager, Don, that he's working on some new room that's being built. So people start speculating, well, what's this new room being built?
Mark Klein got suspicious when the workmen constructing the room treated it as hush-hush. So how do you know that it wasn't just some kind of newfangled AT&T thing that was going beyond what had already been established for its security purposes elsewhere?
They wouldn't need the NSA for that purpose. The odd thing about the whole room, of course, was that only this one guy who had clearance from the NSA could get in there. So that changes the whole context of what this is about.
So that's Mark Klein, and he did this at a time in which it was very difficult, and it's still difficult to be a whistleblower. But here's what he had to say about coming forward in 2006 and in 2007. He worked to show the media that this warrantless surveillance was unfolding. He went to civil liberties groups. He gave them documents. He went to the Los Angeles Times. He went to the New York Times. He sent letters out to members of Congress, to senators, and that turned out to be a dead end. He said in this interview for PBS Frontline that he never got anything back from the Senate or Congress. They were staying away from me like I was some kind of plague. No one would answer me. To this day, none of them answered me. The LA Times eventually killed the story because I was told John Negroponte talked to their top guy. That was the director of national intelligence right now. So the person who holds that position under President Donald Trump is Tulsi Gabbard. She spent the last week going after those who are engaged in so-called politically motivated leaks. So attacking media sources, saying that she is going to refer anyone talking to the press to the Justice Department for prosecution. And so the DNI back then went ahead and killed the story, and the LA Times went along with it. There are very few people who came forward during the time that Mark Klein blew the whistle to challenge warrantless wiretapping. You can count the individuals that spoke out about the violations of the Constitution and Americans' privacy rights on one, maybe two hands. And so rest in power, Mark Klein. Thank you for speaking the truth and standing up for civil liberties. Let's go to the interview that we have for this week. My guest is Lauren Harper. She's the Daniel Ellsberg Chair on Government Secrecy. And we are talking about, well, there's two particular stories, and there's been some developments since I recorded the interview with her. So a judge faced this lawsuit that was intending to stop the destruction, the burning or shredding of documents from USAID. Since the agency or government allegedly claimed that all of this activity had stopped, the judge did not grant some kind of a restraining order to stop the actions. So we discussed that case. There's also a conversation a bit about Doja and what this agency has been doing to block or thwart Freedom of Information Act requests from journalists, but a lawsuit did uh, end in a positive decision with a judge ordering the disclosure of records. It's unclear what we're going to learn. So I talk with Lauren Harper about the state of records and efforts to obtain transparency with those two salient examples. But then we get into a wider conversation about the Trump administration in its first 50 days. I think it's been a little bit more than 50 days. So here's Lauren Harper. I hope you appreciate this interview. Hello and welcome to this conversation. I'm joined by Lauren Harper, who is the Daniel Ellsberg Chair on Government Secrecy for the Freedom of the Press Foundation. And welcome.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
And I did a little bit of a setup before going into this conversation, but you're here because we're pouring gasoline on the fire. It would seem like every day, the escalation, the growing secrecy by President Donald Trump's administration. And then there's a new player for those of us who follow secrecy, because it's like we have this outsider that's been brought in the form of Elon Musk, who's also putting his hands on the levers. So everything that anybody knows that's ever followed the Freedom of Information Act, followed secrecy abuses in general, it now gets more complicated by the way that we're seeing agencies entirely decimated or fractured by Elon Musk's interference. So perhaps before we get into specific topics, let me just ask you, since we're a little more than 50 days, I think we're around the 50-day mark for the Trump administration in the second term. And given that we had already had some experience with Trump with the first term, what stands out to you about these first days as you try to just get a hold of how we're going to even have any openness in government for the next 4 years?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that Elon Musk is the X factor, no pun intended. Trump's first administration gave us insight to how he might act with his second term. Things like deleting data from agency website. He did that in the first term. His team took down something like 40,000 data sets from data.gov in the first few months. So it's not a surprise to see that kind of being done again this term. The same goes for targeting inspectors general, which play a big role in getting information out to the public that agencies would otherwise try to conceal. But the attack on inspectors general has taken a step up this term. We're seeing more drastic firings. I think something now like 33, 34 of those positions are vacant. That's a concern. Something else that he did during the first term that I imagine we'll see again this term is instructing agencies not to share information with Congress, especially when congressional requests for information are coming from minority staff. I imagine we'll see that more this term. But certainly, during Trump's first term, FOIA, as you well know and have reported, has never been administered well, regardless of whether or not the person in charge at the White House is a Democrat or Republican. But what is very different this term is certainly the aggressiveness with which the Trump administration is putting its stamp on federal agencies, particularly through the work of Elon Musk's DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. And the biggest impact there that is very hard to get insight into is, obviously DOGE is trying to, if not eliminate entire agencies, is pushing for massive reductions within agencies. And the concern is that this will impact FOIA staff, because typically during something like a government shutdown, FOIA staff are not treated as essential personnel, and they are among those who do not work. They're not considered essential workers. So it makes sense to worry that FOIA staff would be included in government-wide reductions in force. And we're starting to see that at various places where DOJ has already embedded. I think there are two really good examples. One is the Office of Management and Budget, which is the office within the Executive Office of the President that housed DOJ's predecessor, the United States Digital Service. We know, thanks to court records, that OMB, which has hundreds of FOIA cases in its backlog, has already had its FOIA staff gutted by something to the tune of 75%. That's an astronomical number. And we can also look to U.S. Agency for International Development, which DOJ is trying to eliminate. They also have quite a few FOIA requests in their backlog, and I think they have something like 6 current cases, FOIA cases in the courts. Well, recently, as of this week, government lawyers are trying to issue stays in their FOIA cases because they don't have the FOIA staff, and they've basically said they only have 3 full-time people working in their FOIA office. So we're starting to see at these particular agencies indications of what we might see elsewhere, which is just that FOIA, which already has backlogs and is understaffed and under-resourced, is going to be hampered drastically by what DOJ is doing.
And then in general, although I do know that this comes up specifically with Doge, but if there are not staff that can process these requests, but a court is ordering the processing of documents, what does an organization do, or what even can a court do to make sure that those records are delivered?
Right. I mean, if I think this is where we're going to start seeing whether or not the Trump administration is going to follow court orders or not. And we have not seen, we've certainly seen agencies, if a court issues a production schedule, let's say like with the CIA or the FBI, the FBI might come back and say, the original production schedule was 500 pages a month. Gosh, we can only do 250 pages a month. And basically, you know, peter down the expectations of the amount of documents that it can release. That's a possibility. I think what we're going to see more of, though, basically are agencies saying we can't do this at all because of staffing issues. So can you grant us what's called an Open America stay? The judge in the USAID case granted it. In that case, the plaintiff didn't push back on the government's arguments. It's unclear what a judge would do if a plaintiff did push back. I think we'll have to wait and see. But the other X factor is, the court isn't the only way, in theory, to help compel an agency's FOIA office actually do what it's supposed to do. Another way that you're supposed to have oversight and improved FOIA compliance is through the Department of Justice's Office of Information Policy. In theory, this should be the office that's, making sure that agencies across the federal government are complying with FOIA. But the Trump administration just fired the information policy director. Unclear who's going to get the eventual directorship, and if that person would be willing to go after agencies, including DOJ, if it ends up having to be subject to FOIA, to actually compel them to follow the law, whether that's in response to a request or litigation. A lot remains to be seen.
All right, so let's get to some specifics.
Mhm.
The fact that, and you were already getting into a little bit, but these reduction of these FOIA offices, just I don't think we've seen anything like it when it comes to a presidential administration. I haven't seen anybody target. And I suppose I'm interested in your comment on this, because when I view the general range of press freedom issues related to journalists, there is a hostility that is fueled by Trump officials towards journalists. But what we saw coming into this administration, at least with the campaign, we didn't see hostility towards government transparency. We've seen officials talk to their supporters about actually dealing with government secrecy. So, I mean, this is what you can expect from someone like Elon Musk and from Donald Trump and others, but it's a little bit different in my mind when you think of this issue because the public that supports Trump, the half of the country or so, a little bit more that voted for Donald Trump, isn't really there to see government agencies be more secretive. In fact, they although it hasn't been delivered, they're very open to more JFK assassination records. They're open to Epstein files, and even though that's sort of like its own circus, I just raise it to say that I wonder how this Trump administration actually defends being ultra secretive to its people.
Right. I mean, it's such an interesting thing to watch. And to me, I think about, what the Trump administration is doing. You mentioned JFK assassination records, because of course there was the executive order on declassifying JFK, RFK, and MLK assassination records. There's also the House Declassification Task Force. To me, these things are stunts, right? The way the House Task Force was set up, it's in no way geared to actually be effective at actually getting records declassified. It doesn't have the authority to declassify anything, and it feels as though it's a PR move meant to appeal to topics that the Trump administration has decided that its base cares about, as opposed to actually, being a full throttled, like, yes, let's be transparent on all the issues. And I think another way you can see this kind of selective cherry pick transparency is looking back to one of the first things the Trump administration did when it came into office the second time was to basically issue a gag order for health agencies like the CDC and places like that on communicating with the public. And at the same time, the CIA director, John Ratcliffe, declassified the CIA's low confidence assessment on the origins of the COVID pandemic. So you have certain agencies that are being empowered to declassify, their interpretation of certain topics, but you have other agencies that are not allowed to communicate with the public at all, which is dangerous, I think. There are real world examples of the dangers of selectively declassifying information. To me, the biggest one is curveball, the invasion of Iraq. Basically, the Bush administration relying on debunked intelligence as a precursor and as an excuse to invade Iraq in 2003. And so these are the kind of things that can happen when you're only looking at a small subset of declassification and you're only focusing on transparency of a very narrow range of issues. And so I think one of the things we need to keep in mind when places, folks like Kash Patel and DNI Gabbard and stuff like that are saying, no, where we are transparent is making sure that we're talking about a whole of government approach to transparency, because that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing really selective, almost like pantomimes of transparency, because even the executive order, hasn't released any information on the JFK assassination yet. And I think we've reached the deadline by which it was supposed to be released. So I think we need to keep an eye out for these things being stunts, for lack of a better word, and not letting ourselves kind of think collectively like, oh, they declassified this. I guess they're doing all right, because they're not. We need a whole of government approach to transparency, and we are getting increasingly the opposite, where the Trump administration is really clamping down on the flow of information and only releasing the selective bits that it wants to.
That's a really good point, because this administration does stand out as one that would use those kinds of tactics, like we saw with the CIA's rendition, detention, and interrogation program, which we know was documented to cover up abuses and alleged torture by selectively releasing information, and then obviously, I think paired with it, although this is outside of the realm of our discussion, but I always am mindful that paired with this, you have this incredible intimidation campaign, or a lot of pressure put on government personnel or employees themselves to not speak with the press. So with the drying up of sources, it becomes even more essential for journalists to turn to records. And then when you can't get them, you basically just have to speculate about the
Yeah.
actions of an administration. And I don't know about you, but that sort of frightens me that we would just be speculating in a climate where we already have conspiracy fueled
Yeah.
nonsense day in and day out. I mean, you can react if you. I was
Yeah,
putting a lot.
no, it's super concerning because you mentioned intimidation of public officials from speaking with journalists. We're also seeing intimidation of public officials in inspectors general's offices from releasing reports that have already been completed. An example that comes to mind might have been last week or the week before. There was a report, I believe, in the Washington Post about how the U.S. Agency for International Development was sitting on two different reports because they were worried about further retaliation from the Trump administration. I don't know what further retaliation against USAID looks like, but they were sitting on reports that looked at basically what the effects of an aid cut would be on the Israel-Hamas ceasefire in Gaza, and also looking at global security threats from withdrawing aid. So they were sitting on these reports because they were worried what the Trump administration would do if they released that. And to me, my immediate reaction, I'm obviously not a federal employee. I am not in that position. But to me, the longer you sit on it, especially at an agency that's going to get gutted, it looks like one way or another, you're decreasing the likelihood that information will ever find its way to the public. And I think, the inspector general element is also very interesting when we're talking about leaks from reporters. There are issues with internal whistleblowing within federal agencies. It's not a perfect system by any means, but it's degraded even further when you don't have inspectors general in their position, or you have acting IGs who are clearly partisan. And when you don't feel confident that you can, as a federal employee, that you can take those routes, it increases the likelihood that you are going to leak to a journalist, and possibly the Trump administration doing something like using the Espionage Act to persecute you for doing so. So the whole situation, I think, it's unprecedented in the fact that we're seeing so many extremes, I think, threaten to come to a head at one time, because certainly a lot of these issues have existed before, but now they're culminating, it appears, all at once. And it's a frightening situation.
It is a bit of a developing perfect storm where you see storylines that were easy to follow all the way back to George W. Bush's administration, basically reaching a kind of apex. So why don't I, before we wrap up our conversation, there are some very specific things I'd like to get to. So there's a lawsuit against the USAID and what we believe is reported document destruction. What's your reaction to this? It's rather stunning that we're talking about an agency just outright destroying records, and then the idea that they couldn't possibly believe that they would be able to keep that secret, so they must
Yeah.
think that they can just defend it out in the open if they're going to do it.
My immediate reaction is what USAID is doing with its records is illegal. It is a clear violation of the Federal Records Act. Documents are either permanent or they're temporary. They are pre-approved by the National Archives and Records Administration. Agencies have to follow these records retention schedules. They cannot just destroy records because an agency, quote unquote, is no longer using them. And they certainly can't do it with records that may be subject to pending FOIA requests and litigation. And the acting executive secretary of USAID, a woman named Erica Carr, told the court that there was nothing wrong with what they were doing because the documents were either classified copies of other agency records, or they contained derivatively classified information that the agency no longer needs. This is wrong on both points. The Federal Records Act makes it super clear that agencies have to treat records they make or receive as federal records, regardless of their classification. And the derivative classification excuse is extremely bizarre to me. As you may know, an original classification decision is the initial determination that information is classified. A derivative decision basically happens whenever an agency employees uses existing classified information in a new way. You could quote it, you could paraphrase it, whatever. These decisions account for the overwhelming majority of classification decisions. If you have in one year, let's say 60,000 original decisions, you have 50 million derivative declassification decisions. It encompasses a lot of records. So you can't just destroy these records because they're no longer being used as you perceive by your agency. And the other thing that's really interesting, I think, about the USAID case is the role that Marco Rubio plays in all of this. And from my perspective, it's absolutely unprecedented because Marco Rubio is the acting head of USAID, which is the agency that appears to be unlawfully destroying its records. He's also the head of the agency that is USAID's successor agency that is responsible for preserving, per the Federal Records Act, all of USAID's records, and that's the State Department. He's also the acting head of the agency that's supposed to investigate unlawful records destruction because he's the acting archivist of the United States. It is an extremely messy situation, and you're forced to wonder, is Marco Rubio, as the acting archivist, going to investigate his other agency's behavior, USAID, and then possibly refer the matter to the Justice Department if he can't compel USAID to retain its records? I don't see a world wherein that happens. So it's just on its face illegal to be destroying these records, and certainly the excuses that Carr gave to the court don't hold water. But Marco Rubio's role in this is also extremely confusing, and I don't think is getting enough attention.
Right. I'm reminded of another staggering example of this where cabinet members are actually being tasked with managing multiple other agencies. And that's what we saw with, although this is again kind of outside of our conversation, but with the firing of Hampton Dellinger, who's supposed to be the Office of Special Counsel chief. They're now going to put the Veterans Affairs secretary in charge of it. I have very negative things to say about the people who are being appointed and whether they're going to actually do anything besides further destroy the agencies. But even if you thought all of these individuals had the best intentions in government, you can't manage this many agencies at the time. Then it's not supposed to be like that. It's not designed like that. So let's get to Doja. And there was the lawsuit against it with the judge issuing a very important decision that is, it would seem, going to force the disclosure of records. That's for Crew, and that they are going to, is this watchdog group that was able to successfully get these records, and the decision that these records would be released. Your reaction to the judge's decision and the evidence before him that I think made it very easy to rule against Doja.
Yeah, well, I think it's an outstanding question if Crew, which Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, will actually get the records. But what happened was Crew filed a FOIA lawsuit both against Doge and the Office of Management and Budget. And as folks may know, Doge has been insisting, we're not subject to FOIA. Instead, we're subject to the Presidential Records Act. The big difference there is FOIA, in theory, if you file a lawsuit, allows you to collect and request these records in real time. Whereas if something is a Presidential Records Act entity, you can't start filing FOIA requests for this information until 5 years after the end of the presidential administration, which means if Doge stayed a PRA entity, we can't start filing FOIA requests for it until 2034. But so what happened in the Crew case is Judge Christopher Cooper, who has a lot of good FOIA rulings, basically said, look, it's really clear that Doge is acting with substantial independent authority from the president. And if an agency is doing that, they cannot be a Presidential Records Act entity. You can only be a PRA entity if you're existing solely to advise the president. And so Judge Cooper basically said, there's no way you're solely advising the president. You are likely subject to FOIA. And so what Cooper did is he basically said that by, I think it was March 27th, that Doge and Crew need to come up with a production schedule for the records at issue in the Crew case, which sounds super promising. I think Doge, to me, it's very clear that Doge should be subject to FOIA, but I don't know that that's necessarily something we can bank on happening. There are two other Doge is going to appeal the ruling first and foremost, and they may end up appealing all the way to the Supreme Court. We don't know, but there are also two other cases brought by two other watchdog organizations challenging Doge's FOIA standing. So depending how those judges rule in those cases, we could have split opinions. It could go up to the Supreme Court. It's this ruling certainly won't be the end of the story.
Right. And for those who are thinking, well, that's the Supreme Court, it's got a majority that favors Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to say something about you? I should have you say something about the fact that the Supreme Court doesn't usually or always take up FOIA cases. Like it wouldn't be unheard of for them to just say, there's not really anything new for us to rule on here.
That's certainly true. They might not. And in that case, there's another option, which I wouldn't say is likely, but there is the option that Congress could pick it up and basically weigh in if there's a conflict between the courts. A member of Congress could at least introduce legislation that it would explicitly say that Doge is subject to FOIA. Now, the likelihood of that passing, I realize, hovers near zero. But if a member of Congress did that, I think it would demonstrate that Congress is capable of being proactive. I think that's something the public needs to see. And there's also precedent for something very similar. In 2016, a Republican representative introduced legislation that would have made the National Security Council, which, much like Doge, is part of the executive office of the president, to explicitly be subject to FOIA rather than the Presidential Records Act. That amendment didn't go anywhere, and it's possible that a Doge FOIA bill would do the same. But it's important to note that there are other routes rather than just the courts that people could be exploring to make Doge subject to FOIA.
I have one more question before we wrap here. And to me, one of the more incredible developments, and it was actually it was a twisted positive, was this ruling that we got from Judge Howell that articulated. It didn't make me feel better about the country in which we live, but it did make me think, oh, maybe the powers that be have worked themselves into a corner here that we'll be able to use to at least know what they're doing. Because the ruling, essentially, for those who may not know what we're talking about, although clearly you and me both know what I'm saying vaguely, there was this ruling in the Trump documents case against the FBI related to the Mar-a-Lago investigative file. I just have this quote in front of me from the judge, and I want to get your response to this before we conclude here, because I do think it speaks a lot to the dynamic in which we have. But Howell said, with the far dampened possibility of any criminal investigation to gather evidence about a president's conduct and of any public enforcement proceeding against a president, and then I'm basically paraphrasing this part, that the majority on the U.S. Supreme Court had, quote, left a FOIA request as a critical tool for the American public to keep apprised of a president's conduct. So essentially, the fact that presidents now have immunity based on the Supreme Court's decision means that there's less of a tool. There's one less tool for the government to block requests for records on those particular presidents.
Mm-hmm.
Your reaction?
Yeah, that was a silver lining ruling for sure. And one of the things I thought was, gosh, when SCOTUS closes the door, then FOIA opens a window. It was an unexpected silver lining to the immunity decision for sure. And she had another excellent quote in there about the FBI's arguments, particularly the Glomar arguments, which was basically that in light of the SCOTUS ruling, that the FBI's arguments crumbled to dust with just as little persuasion. So yeah, it was a terrific ruling. I look forward to actually seeing I think the FBI was supposed to provide a timetable for release for those records late February. I haven't actually followed up to see it, but it was definitely a surprising benefit, I would say, of the immunity ruling.
Yeah, if I'm correct here, this decision goes back to the flushing of documents down the toilet by Donald Trump. And so Jason Leopold obviously well known for his FOIA work, decided to get records related. So I hope I'm anxiously anticipating reading
Me too.
whatever comes out of it, given that all of those cases are completely over.
Yeah.
But thank you. Thank you very much for joining. There'll be much to follow. I expect we'll be chatting again before the year is over, just given how much there's likely to happen with secrecy. Is there anything you wanted to say before we conclude here in the final minutes?
No, this was a pleasure. I hope we talk again because, I mean, as you mentioned at the beginning, we're on perhaps day 50. What are things going to look like at day 100? What are things going to look like in 6 months? So it is a quickly evolving situation, and I hope we get to keep in touch about it.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right. My pleasure.
Once again, thank you for tuning in to the Dissenter Weekly. You can go to thedissenter.org and become a subscriber if you are not subscribed already. There's a free and a paid version. Paying means that I'm grateful to you for helping to fund this journalism on whistleblowers, secrecy, and freedom of the press. And also, you can subscribe to the Dissenter Weekly on any of the podcasting platforms, your preferred podcasting platform. Give it a rating if you liked this week's episode. If you like the episodes that are coming from this show, this was just started in January, and we'll keep this going throughout Donald Trump's second term, as there is plenty for us to document, track, and follow. So thank you. We'll be back soon with another episode of the Dissenter Weekly.